Emerson Bennett was 27 years old, a Juilliard-trained pianist with chestnut hair that fell past her shoulders and blue-gray eyes that had once dreamed of concert halls in Vienna. She'd given up everything, her scholarship, her future, her music, to keep a broken family afloat in Reno, Nevada. So when her older sister Willow showed up that morning with a borrowed Gucci dress and a smile too bright to be real, whispering about a piano job at a high-end Las Vegas restaurant that paid $8,000 a month, Emerson believed her. She shouldn't have. 6 hours later, Emerson wasn't standing in front of a grand piano. She was standing in the basement of the Crimson Palace, the largest casino on the Strip, staring at her own sister's face as the iron door slammed shut behind her. "You never deserved that talent," Willow said, her voice cold as the Nevada winter. "Juilliard was supposed to be mine." And just like that, with one click of a lock, 27 years of blood turned to ash. What Emerson didn't know yet was that her own father had signed the paperwork. What she didn't know was that the casino's owner, Viktor Volkov, had plans for her that no decent woman could survive. And what no one in that building could have predicted was that 3 nights later, bruised and broken and running for her life through a crowded casino floor, she'd collide literally with the one man in all of Nevada who could burn the whole place to the ground. His name was Beckett Holloway. They called him the Wolf of Nevada, and he hadn't looked at a woman the way he was about to look at her in 5 long years. If this is your first time here, do me a favor and hit that like button right now. It really helps stories like this reach more people. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss a single tale of justice, love, and the kind of men who still know what honor means. And drop a comment below telling me which state or country you're watching from tonight, because I read every single one. Now let's get right back to the story. The iron door had barely shut when a woman emerged from the darkness at the far end of the corridor. She was tall and thin, with dyed blonde hair showing dark roots gone gray, lips painted a deep red like dried blood, and a tiny silver cross hanging at her throat. In a heavy Eastern European accent, she introduced herself as Magda and said that from this moment on, Emerson belonged to her, not to Viktor Volkov, not to the casino, but to her personally, until she decided to sell her. Emerson opened her mouth to protest, but a slap cracked across her left cheek so fast she didn't have time to dodge. The taste of blood rose in her mouth. Magda curled her lip, pulled a pair of professional hair shears from her coat pocket, the kind hairdressers used, the kind so sharp it could slice a finger if handled carelessly. She shoved Emerson down into a metal chair in the middle of the room, and without asking another question, grabbed her long chestnut brown hair that fell to the middle of her back and hacked it off. Strand after strand fell onto the cold cement floor, like pieces of Emerson's life falling with it. She bit down so hard on her lip that it bled, refusing to let herself cry in front of this woman. When Magda was finished, she yanked the Gucci dress off Emerson's body, leaving her shivering in her thin outer coat before shoving her into a cheap black silk nightgown. Then, Magda carelessly tossed the worn coat back at her, muttering that the basement was too cold for the merchandise to freeze yet. Magda inspected her body the way someone might inspect a horse before auction, made notes in a small leather book, and muttered under her breath in Russian. When she was done, she shoved Emerson into a windowless room at the end of the concrete hallway, locked the door behind her, and left her with a narrow bed, a dim yellow bulb hanging from the ceiling, and the muffled sound of choking sobs drifting in from the rooms next door. Emerson collapsed to the floor and pressed her back against the freezing door, her trembling arms wrapped around her knees. She wanted to cry, but she didn't dare, because she knew that tears in a place like this were the mark of someone about to die. And then, just then, her fingers brushed against a crumpled piece of paper inside the pocket of the thin coat Magda hadn't bothered to strip off yet. She pulled it out and opened it beneath the yellow light. It was a payment receipt printed on paper, with the letterhead of the Crimson Palace, bearing Willow Bennett's name, and a number that stole the air from her lungs. $780,000 had been cleared in debt on this very day, the day her sister brought her here. Emerson stared at the paper for a long time, her blood turning cold as if someone had poured ice water straight into her veins. And in that instant, everything became clear, like a blade driven through her chest. She hadn't been kidnapped. She was merchandise, sold to pay off the debt of someone she had once called sister. Every smile from that morning, every tender question about their father during the drive, every childhood memory Willow had brought up along the 6-hour trip from Reno down to Vegas, all of it had been a tool. She didn't feel pain anymore. She felt only a cold emptiness so profound it was almost calm. And in that calm, The memory of her mother rose more clearly than ever before. She remembered the summer when she was 10, when the doctor at renowned regional hospital told the whole family that her mother had terminal ovarian cancer. She remembered the 2 years of chemotherapy, her mother's beautiful blonde hair falling out in clumps, her face growing thinner with every passing week. She remembered the final night at her bedside, when she had just turned 12, her mother holding her hand and whispering that Emerson was the strongest daughter she had ever known, that no matter what happened in life, the only thing she had to do was live, just live, and everything else would find its own way afterward. Emerson pressed the receipt to her chest and whispered the answer she hadn't had the chance to say until 15 years later. "I'll live, Mom. I promise." That night she didn't sleep for even a single second. She sat upright on the edge of the bed, her ears straining to catch every footstep of the guards moving through the hallway outside, counting the time between each patrol, memorizing the sound of the iron doors at both ends of the row of rooms, memorizing the smell of cigarettes one of the guards smoked, memorizing the filthy laugh of another man sometime around 3 in the morning. In her mind, a map began to form, piece by piece, just as she had once memorized a complex sonata at Juilliard. She didn't know how she was going to get out of this place, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She wasn't going to die in that room. Around 6 in the morning, the sharp click of a lock pulled Emerson out of her half-conscious haze. Magda appeared in the doorway with 2 large guards dressed in black and motioned for her to follow. They led her through a long concrete corridor where the cold white glare of fluorescent lights washed over every face and made everyone look like corpses, then shoved her into a wide dining room with long stainless steel tables, like something out of a prison. Around 20 girls sat in silence eating oatmeal from plastic bowls. No one looked up, no one spoke, no one dared chew too loudly. Emerson stopped short in the doorway, and for one brief second, she thought she had stepped into a horror film by mistake, instead of standing in the basement of the biggest casino on the Las Vegas Strip. One of the guards shoved her shoulder toward an empty table at the far end of the room. She took a bowl of oatmeal, sat down, and at that exact moment, a small, pale, blonde girl, sitting 2 places away, shifted a little closer. She looked very young, with large brown eyes so empty they seemed to have stared through far too many dark things already, and a thin scar ran from her hand to her elbow along the inside of her wrist. The girl slid a small piece of bread hidden in her sleeve across the table toward Emerson, and whispered in a South Texas drawl to eat it and not let Magda see. Emerson looked up, and for the first time in nearly 24 hours, she saw a pair of eyes that carried no intention of hurting her. The girl said her name was Della Price, 19 years old, and that she had been there for 4 months. Della spoke very fast and very softly, keeping her face lowered over her bowl, as if she were simply eating. She told Emerson that she had tried to escape twice. The first time they beat her until 3 ribs on her right side were broken. The second time they locked her in a dark room for 3 days without water or food. And after that she had learned the only truth that mattered. That in a place like this, the ones who resisted were the ones who died first. If you wanted to live, you had to pretend to be obedient. You had to smile when they told you to smile, stay silent when they told you to stay silent, and let VIP clients put their hands on you without even flinching. Only the girls who were best at pretending ever had a chance to wait for some lucky day that might never come. Emerson swallowed the dry piece of bread down her tight throat and asked softly how many girls were being kept there. Della darted her eyes around the room and answered that there were 47, divided across 3 levels. The first level was for new girls like Emerson. The second was for mid-tier VIP clients. The third was for the richest gamblers in Las Vegas, the ones who paid $50,000 a night and could request anything they wanted. Della said their clients came from every kind of world. There was a Nevada state senator who came on Tuesday nights, an investment fund chairman from California who booked weekends, a famous Vegas attorney named Preston Kane, who had a taste for girls who were brand new and liked to beat them during sex, along with 2 or 3 B-list movie stars whose names Della wouldn't say because she was afraid the cameras might catch her lips moving. Every girl had her own number. Every time one of them was sent upstairs, it was recorded, and anyone who gave a client a reason to complain disappeared the next morning, with no one ever knowing where she had gone. Emerson asked about the cameras. Della shook her head almost imperceptibly and whispered that there were cameras in every corner except the VIP rooms because the clients demanded absolute privacy, that all the guards carried guns, and that every emergency exit was locked with keycards only senior managers had access to. There was no way out. It had been 4 months since she had seen real sunlight. When Della said that, Her voice trembled for only half a syllable before going flat again, like a candle just beginning to flare before someone's hand crushed the flame. Emerson looked into those empty eyes, and for the first time in her life understood what despair looked like after it had passed the stage of pain. And in that very moment, in that room full of girls eating oatmeal in silence, Emerson made herself a promise even more important than the promise she had whispered to her mother the night before, that if she got out of this place, she would come back and take every one of those girls with her. By 7 that evening, Magda came back to Emerson's room with 2 middle-aged women in gray uniforms, whom Della would later call the makeup artists of hell. They painted her face in silence, smudging heavy black shadow over her eyelids, brushing deep red onto her lips, and dusting a glittering powder across her collarbones that made Emerson feel as if they were sealing a mask onto her skin that would never wash away. They dressed her in a black gown with a back cut so low it plunged to her waist, along with a pair of black high heels with thin straps, the kind she had never been able to wear for more than 15 minutes in her life. Magda stood with her arms folded, watching, nodding with satisfaction, then shoved her into a private elevator that went straight up to the 30th floor of the casino tower. When the elevator doors opened, Emerson stepped into a corridor carpeted in the color of dark wine, wing crystal chandeliers hanging at even intervals on both sides, and the thick scent of Cuban cigars and expensive perfume hanging in the air so heavily it almost felt solid. Magda pushed her into VIP room 7 and whispered in her ear that all she had to do was pour the drinks, smile, say nothing, and pray that none of the 3 guests tonight picked her. Inside, 3 men were seated at an ebony poker table. One had salt and pepper hair and wore a dark blue suit, and Emerson dimly recognized him from state election coverage on the news. Another was short and heavy-set, wearing a silk shirt with a diamond pin fastened to it. The third looked younger, around 40, with eyes as sharp as knives. They watched her enter the room the way men watched a new appetizer being set before them. Emerson lowered her head, walked to the liquor cabinet, and poured 25-year-old Macallan whiskey into 3 crystal glasses. When she approached the table, the man with the salt and pepper hair set his rough hand on her thigh just above the hem of her dress, his palm heavy as stone. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry out. She gave him the exact smile Della had taught her that morning, then said in the sweetest voice she could fake that she would go get more ice for them. The man flicked his hand in permission. She stepped out of the room, her heart pounding so hard she thought the 3 men behind her might be able to hear it. The hallway was deserted. She walked straight to a door at the far end of the corridor, with a small sign that read, "Staff Only," pushed it open, and found herself in a brightly lit kitchen that served the VIP suites, every steel surface gleaming under the lights. 2 chefs were working on a lobster dish in the far corner and didn't pay any attention to her. Emerson swept her eyes around the room and spotted a metal door in the back wall with the words "Emergency Exit" posted above it. Her heart lurched. She ran to it and shoved the handle. The door didn't move. She looked down and saw a small black plastic keycard reader mounted beside it, its red light blinking as if it were mocking her. She shoved again, harder this time, more desperate, then tried twisting a secondary handle, then slammed her hand against the panic bar. But it had been designed to open only if the correct card was scanned at the same moment the fire alarm system was activated. And then, in that instant, a cold hand clamped hard onto the back of her neck and yanked her backward. Magda was standing there, and Emerson had no idea how long she had been watching. Her face was twisted by a quiet rage more terrifying than screaming could ever be. She didn't say a word. She simply struck Emerson across the mouth, hard enough that Emerson felt her teeth cut into the inside of her lower lip and tasted blood spilling from the corner of her mouth. Magda grabbed her by the hair, dragged her into a blind corner beside the freezer, slammed her face against the freezing steel wall, and whispered in a voice so calm it turned monstrous that if the little bitch ever tried something like that again, she wouldn't bother bringing her upstairs anymore. She would make one phone call to a cartel route that moved merchandise across the southern border, where there were no cameras, no laws, no one searching for girls who disappeared, and she guaranteed the girl would be wishing for death within a week. Then she shoved Emerson to the kitchen floor and signaled for 2 guards to drag her back to her room and lock the door. Emerson sat on the floor of that room, her shaking hand rising to touch her swollen lower lip, blood smearing across her fingertips as red as the lipstick they had painted on her earlier that evening. She didn't cry. She sat with her back against the wall, closed her eyes, and let her fingers move through the freezing air in front of her, playing in her mind every note of Clair de Lune, the piece her mother had taught her when she was 7 years old, back when her mother had still been strong enough to sit beside the old piano in the living room of their house in Reno. She remembered every frown when she struck a wrong note, every gentle stroke through her hair when she played an entire passage correctly, every trace of rose tea her mother used to brew on those afternoons when she taught her music. She played that piece in her mind from beginning to end, and then from beginning to end again, through the whole of that night, like a silent prayer that no concrete wall on earth could ever hold back. The entire next day, Emerson was locked in her room without breakfast, without lunch, with nothing but a single bottle of lukewarm water thrown in around noon. At about 7 that evening, Magda returned with the makeup team. But this time the atmosphere was completely different. No one spoke. Magda carried a red velvet box, and inside it was a red silk dress cut low across the chest in the style of a European auction, along with a pair of 4-inch high heels. In a cold voice, she announced that tonight's client was a special VIP, paying $50,000 for one night, and that any mistake the girl made would be paid for with her life. The moment the name Preston Kane was spoken, Emerson felt the blood inside her turn 1 degree colder, because it was exactly the name Della had whispered to her in the breakfast room the day before, the name of a famous Vegas lawyer who liked girls who were brand new and liked to beat them during sex. At exactly 8 that night, 2 guards took her up in a private elevator to the 47th floor, where the largest penthouse in the Crimson Palace occupied an entire level. When the doors opened, they revealed a vast space with black marble floors, floor-to-ceiling glass looking straight down over the glittering Las Vegas Strip, and the thick smell of whiskey mixed with Cohiba cigars. Preston Kane was already there, seated in a black leather armchair, with a bottle of Johnny Walker Blue Label half empty on the table beside him. He was 45 years old, with a square jaw, hair slicked back with gel, a face flushed red from alcohol, and pale blue eyes that were dull with drink, yet lit by the unmistakable look of a man who was used to having anything he wanted. He motioned for her to come closer, and sneered that Magda had chosen better merchandise than usual today. Emerson stepped toward him 1 step at a time, her heart pounding wildly, Della's warning repeating over and over in her head that she had to pretend to be obedient. But when Preston grabbed her arm hard, shoved her down into the chair beside him, and dropped his heavy hand onto her thigh, she understood that he wasn't the kind of client who could be patient. In less than 3 minutes, he was on his feet, dragging her toward the king bed, covered in white bedding in the master bedroom, throwing her down onto it, and with one savage yank tearing open the shoulder of the red silk dress. She shoved him away, and he answered with a slap so hard she saw stars burst across her vision and heard a high ringing in her ears. He pinned her down, his breath thick with alcohol spilling over her face, his hand tracing the seam of the dress to tear away the last layer of fabric. In the moment when her eyes filled with tears, her fingers reached blindly across the nightstand and touched something heavy, cold, and sharp-edged. It was a Baccarat crystal tumbler, with whiskey still left in it, thick and heavy enough to be used as a weapon. She wrapped her hand around the base, threw every last ounce of strength she had into her arm, and brought it down hard against Preston's left temple. The sound of crystal shattering was dry and final, like a gunshot. He let out a broken grunt and collapsed onto the mattress, blood beginning to pour from the wound at his temple, staining the white pillow red, and he didn't move. Emerson didn't know whether he was dead or only unconscious, and she didn't have time to check. She sprang off the bed, yanked open the bedroom door, ran into the sitting room, kicked away the 4-inch heels, and bolted straight toward the emergency exit door at the corner of the hallway that she had managed to glimpse when she was first brought in. She shoved at it, and the panic bar gave way without a keycard, because it was a mandatory fire stairwell under Nevada State Code. And then she ran down. 47 floors of spiraling concrete stairs stretched beneath her like a bottomless well. She ran, her bare feet slamming against the freezing cement, the torn red dress flying behind her like a shredded flag, mascara streaming down her cheeks in 2 black lines all the way to her chin, dried blood caked at the corner of her swollen mouth. She ran as if all of hell were chasing her, and in truth it was. Somewhere above her, she heard the alarm begin to scream, heard the pounding of guards' shoes on the stairwell, heard the crackle of radios ordering them to grab the girl in the red dress before she made it out of the building. But Emerson didn't stop for even a single second. Every breath was a promise to her mother. Every step was an oath to Della. By the time she reached the 20th floor, her legs had already gone numb. By the 10th, Her lungs burned as if fire had been poured into them. By the third, blood was seeping from the soles of her feet, where some shard along the way had cut into them, but still she didn't stop. And when she slammed through the ground floor emergency door, it didn't open onto the street the way she had imagined in her mind. She burst straight into the main lobby of the Crimson Palace, in the middle of a packed Friday night, into the sight of hundreds of eyes turning toward her all at once. The clock hanging above the casino reception desk read 11:47 on Friday night, and the Crimson Palace was at the most deranged peak hour of the week. Hundreds of gamblers crowded around the blackjack and roulette tables. Thousands of slot machines rang out without pause. Crystal chandeliers hanging 5 meters above reflected across the red marble floor in streaks of light like blood running, and the smell of Cuban cigars mixed with expensive perfume hung so thick in the air it was hard to breathe. In the middle of all that glittering excess, Emerson burst out from the emergency exit at the corner of the lobby like a wounded animal escaping a trap. She staggered through the crowd with one foot smeared in blood, the red dress torn from the shoulder all the way down to her thigh, exposing the pale line of her collarbone, her tangled hair plastered to her cheeks with sweat, mascara running in 2 black streams down to her chin, her lips swollen purple. The gamblers turned to stare. Some gasped softly. Some hurriedly pulled their wives away. Some took out their phones to film, then lowered them again when they saw the look in her eyes. But Emerson didn't care about any of them. She knew only one thing. She had to run for the main entrance 30 meters away, where the lights of the Las Vegas Strip shimmered through the glass. She lunged straight through the crowd, shoving aside a man holding a glass of champagne, knocking a woman in an evening gown back down into her chair, and at the exact moment she thought the doors were close enough to reach with one more stretch of her hand, she slammed into something so solid it felt like a wall. But it wasn't a wall. It was the chest of a man wrapped beneath a black suit, tailored to the exact width of his broad shoulders, and the impact was hard enough to throw her backward, to make her lose her balance, and she would have crashed to the floor if one hand hadn't caught her arm in time. Beckett Holloway stood there, having just stepped out of the private elevator from the 50th floor, after a meeting that had lasted 4 hours with Viktor Volkov, a meeting in which 2 lifelong enemies had been forced to sit across from one another because of a port dispute in Reno that neither the Irish Alliance nor the Volkov family wanted to let escalate into open war. He wore a custom-tailored black Tom Ford suit, a white shirt fastened with platinum cufflinks, the Patek Philippe Nautilus on his left wrist, flashing beneath the chandelier light, and eyes so cold and metallic gray that the man facing him upstairs had broken into sweat, even though the room had been kept at 64 degrees. At 38 years old, Beckett had spent the last decade building an empire of steel and shadows, a man whose authority was carved as much by his age as by his unforgiving nature. 4 Irish bodyguards stood spread out behind him, Finn O'Brien on his right, all 4 dressed in black, each with a hand already resting inside his jacket where the gun was hidden. The collision had lasted no more than a second, but when Beckett lowered his head and looked at the woman who had just crashed into his chest, time inside his mind slowed in a way that felt unnatural, slowed enough for him to hear the sound of his own heartbeat striking harder than usual. The woman looked up at him, and her eyes widened in panic, blue-gray eyes the color of a storm gathering over the Nevada highlands before rain, eyes he had seen in dreams every night for the past 5 years, the eyes of Rosalind on the final morning she had still been alive before the Volkov family took her from their home. Beckett froze. The fingers holding her arm tightened without his meaning them to, not to keep her from falling, but because his body suddenly refused to let go. His gaze swept over her in 2 seconds, and in those 2 seconds he read the whole story the way he would read a case file. The bruise on her left cheek had already turned yellow-gray, which meant she had been struck around 24 to 48 hours earlier. Her lower lip was swollen and split, dried blood at the corner of her mouth, which meant a violent slap sometime in the last 12 hours. The low-cut red dress in the style of a European auction, the kind he had seen Magda put on girls during the times he came here for business. The shoulder torn by hand rather than cut, which meant she had just been attacked. Bare feet, bleeding soles, which meant she had just run down dozens of floors of emergency stairs. And then, finally, those eyes. Those eyes were looking up at him with a mixture of fear and desperation that he had seen only once in his life, 5 years earlier, on his wife's face when she had barely had enough strength left to whisper her final 4 words, "You came too late." Something deep inside Beckett's chest, something he had locked shut after Rosalind's funeral and sworn never to open again, split with a small crack. And through that crack, a spark of fury he had held down for 5 years flared into a black fire. In that moment, the casino lobby was still roaring. The chandeliers were still glittering. The slot machines were still chiming. But to Beckett Holloway and the strange, trembling woman in his grasp, the whole world had fallen into absolute silence. That moment of silence was shattered by the sound of boots striking hard against the marble floor from the direction of the emergency stairwell. Magda appeared first, breathing hard, her red lipstick smeared beyond the line of her mouth, followed by 2 large guards in black, each gripping a stun baton. Magda swept her eyes across the crowd looking for Emerson, and when she saw the girl standing in the grasp of a man in a black suit, she froze for exactly half a second, just long enough to recognize who he was, then stepped forward with a fawning smile hastily pasted across her face. In a voice so gentle it sounded fake, she said she was sorry to disturb Mr. Holloway, that this was only one defective piece of merchandise, that the girl had gone a little too far because of the drugs, and that they would handle it quickly, that he didn't need to concern himself. One of the 2 guards didn't wait for an order before reaching out to grab Emerson by the wrist and drag her away. That hand hadn't even touched her skin when Beckett simply lifted his left hand slightly to chest level, without saying a word, just that small lift of the hand. Finn O'Brien, standing behind him, understood the signal instantly, from 15 years of working at Beckett's side. He pulled the black-handled Sig Sauer P226 from inside his coat, with the kind of speed that could come only from instinct forged in war, and leveled the barrel straight at the center of the guard's forehead as he reached out. The man froze, his fingers no more than 2 inches from Emerson's wrist. The entire casino lobby seemed to fall into a strange silence. The slot machines were still chiming, but no one was talking anymore. The nearest gamblers backed away 2 or 3 steps. A few people were already hurrying toward the exit. A VIP guest at the nearby blackjack table stood up and walked away without even collecting his winnings. Beckett's 3 other bodyguards had already spread out in a quiet half-circle behind Beckett and Emerson, their hands resting inside their jackets as well. Magda stood perfectly still, her face gone chalk white beneath the heavy powder, because she understood that in the underworld of Nevada, if Beckett Holloway gave a single nod, she would be dead in 30 seconds, and Victor Volkov wouldn't dare part his lips to ask for justice, because even Victor needed Beckett more than he needed her. Beckett didn't look at Magda. He slipped the black Tom Ford jacket from his shoulders in one slow, deliberate motion and draped it over Emerson's trembling body, pulling the lapels up to cover the torn shoulder of her dress. The jacket was far too large for her, falling nearly to her knees, carrying with it the scent of cedarwood and expensive leather. Then he turned his head and looked at Magda for the first time, his gray eyes unblinking, his voice low and even, like a stone sinking to the bottom of a glass. He said that from this moment forward, the girl belonged to him, that if anyone in this building or in any other building belonging to the Volkov family dared lay one more finger on her, he would level the Crimson Palace within 48 hours, and that Magda could climb to the 50th floor herself and repeat every word to Victor, that Beckett Holloway had just taken this girl off the board. Magda couldn't answer. She only nodded quickly, then lowered her head and signaled for the 2 guards to step back. Beckett placed his right hand against the small of Emerson's back, his fingers spread wide in a gesture that felt like a shielded archway, and led her through the main lobby. The crowd of guests and staff parted to either side into a wide path without anyone needing to shout. Heads lowered, eyes turned away. When the group stepped through the revolving doors and out beneath the front awning, Vegas was under an unusual desert night rain, large drops falling heavily onto the hot asphalt and drawing up a sharp, bitter smell. The black Rolls-Royce Phantom was already waiting, the driver holding open the rear door. Emerson managed only 2 more steps before her knees gave way beneath her. Her body had been pushed beyond its limit. Beckett didn't let her touch the ground. He bent down, slid one arm beneath her knees, the other behind her back, and lifted her straight off the pavement as easily as though he were carrying a child. He placed her onto the black leather back seat, got in beside her, and shut the door. The Phantom rolled away from the Crimson Palace beneath the pounding rain, while behind them, Magda stood under the awning and watched it go, knowing that the small broken girl had just become the most valuable and most dangerous piece on the board in all of Nevada. When Emerson opened her eyes again, the first thing she noticed wasn't the light, wasn't the sound, but the scent. A scent of clean linen laced with the faintest trace of lavender, the kind of smell she hadn't known since her mother died. She lay still, not daring to move, trying to piece together where she was. The ceiling rose at least 4 meters overhead, with exposed wooden beams in a warm brown stretching across it, and a wrought iron chandelier in a Mediterranean style hanging at the center. She turned her head to the left and saw a wall of glass running from floor to ceiling. Beyond it lay a garden planted with olive trees and enormous red stone formations stretching all the way to the horizon. A view she recognized at once from old postcards. Red Rock Canyon on the outskirts of Las Vegas. The sunlight pouring through the glass told her the day had already slipped into late afternoon. She tested her fingers, then her toes, and found that every fiber of her body ached, but nothing was bleeding anymore. The soles of her feet had been wrapped in clean white bandages. Her lower lip had been covered with a cool layer of ointment. The bruise on her left cheek had been dressed with a small medicated pad that smelled faintly of antiseptic. She was wearing an ivory silk nightgown that fell to her knees, spotless, brand new, and not her own. Just then the door opened softly, and a silver-haired woman with her hair pinned into a bun at the back of her head stepped inside carrying a tray of tea. She looked to be around 60, small in frame, dressed in a simple dark blue house dress in the old European style, with blue eyes so gentle that Emerson needed several seconds to believe they were real. The woman set the tray down on the small table beside the bed, then sat in the chair next to it with the ease of someone who had done this more times than could be counted. She introduced herself as Bridget Moss, the housekeeper of this estate for the past 32 years, and told Emerson that she had slept for 14 straight hours. She said Mr. Holloway's private doctor had arrived at 3 a.m. to examine her, that fortunately there were no broken bones, no internal injuries, only bruising, a split lip, cuts across the soles of her feet that had required 7 stitches, and severe exhaustion caused by dehydration and lack of sleep. Bridget said all of this in a voice as soft as if she were reading out a baking recipe, as though the sight of a stranger being carried into the house in torn and ruined condition in the middle of the night was something she had witnessed before. Emerson asked about Preston Kane. Bridget lifted one eyebrow slightly, then replied that Mr. Holloway wasn't the sort of man who left loose ends behind, and that she needn't worry about that name for another second in her life. Emerson asked where she was. Bridget said this was the master's private residence, a 1-story Mediterranean villa spread across 12,000 square feet on the edge of Red Rock Canyon, 45 minutes from the Las Vegas Strip if traffic wasn't bad, surrounded by 20 acres of private land that no one was permitted to enter without the owner's approval. Then Bridget helped Emerson sit up and placed a warm cup of chamomile tea in her hands. After Emerson managed to drink half the cup, Bridget rose and led her on a quiet tour of her section of the house. A bedroom with an ensuite bathroom lined in travertine stone, a dressing room where several simple outfits in exactly her size had already been hung, and a wide corridor paved in reddish terracotta leading toward the library. When they reached the far end of the eastern hallway, Emerson noticed a heavy oak door standing shut, with no handle on the outside, only a lock. She slowed, her gaze sharpening with curiosity. Bridget stopped as well and rested a gentle hand on Emerson's arm, her voice still soft, but this time carrying a layer of firmness beneath it, like hard stone buried under loose sand. She said that in this house there was only one thing Emerson was being asked to respect, absolutely, that she must never try to open that door, never ask what was inside, and never mention its existence to the master of the house. It was the only place in all 12,000 square feet where even Bridget, who had lived there for 32 years, was allowed to enter only 3 times a year to dust in complete silence. Emerson didn't ask another question. She only nodded. But as she walked past that door, she felt something strange slide down her spine, as if behind that oak wood a secret was breathing. Bridget knocked on Emerson's door and said that Mr. Holloway was waiting for her in the library, if she felt well enough to come down. She had already laid out a simple moss-green silk dress for her, soft and comfortable, falling to her ankles so it wouldn't hurt the wounds on the soles of her feet, along with a pair of thin velvet slippers in the same shade. Emerson stood in front of the mirror and looked at the woman reflected there for nearly a full minute, unable to believe it was really her, because only 2 nights earlier that same woman had been kneeling on the cement floor of a windowless basement. She followed Bridget down the terracotta-tiled hallway, making a point not to glance toward the locked oak door at the other end. The library lay in the west wing of the estate, a room with a ceiling soaring up nearly 8 meters, 3 walls covered from floor to ceiling in walnut shelves heavy with books, and the 4th made entirely of enormous glass windows, looking straight out onto the red stone ridges of Red Rock Canyon, burning beneath the gold and orange light of sunset. In the middle of the room, on a burgundy Persian rug, stood two black leather armchairs facing one another across a low table. Beckett was already seated in the chair farthest from the door. He wasn't wearing a suit the way he had that night at the casino. This time he wore a black shirt without a tie, the top two buttons undone, his sleeves rolled with careful precision to the elbows, revealing part of his left forearm and a tattoo she hadn't seen before. A gray-black wolf, snarling with a black rose nearly wilted, clenched in its jaws. The lines carved so deeply and so meticulously that Emerson understood at once it wasn't decoration, but a gravestone carried on the body. He stood when she entered, and motioned toward the chair opposite him with a slow gesture, without smiling, without rushing toward her. On the table sat a white ceramic teapot, 2 cups, and the warm scent of chamomile drifting through the room. He poured for her first, then for himself, and sat back down, and for nearly 2 minutes after that, he didn't say a single word. He only held his cup in both hands and looked out the window, giving her time. Emerson sat across from a man who had just pulled her out of hell, a man who, with nothing more than a slight lift of his hand, had made a guard far bigger than himself freeze beneath the barrel of a gun, a man Magda herself hadn't dared raise her eyes to when she spoke to him, and Emerson didn't know where to begin. At last Beckett spoke, his voice lower than the sound of the wind brushing softly against the window seams. He said that she didn't have to tell him anything if she wasn't ready, that in this house she could stay silent for as long as she wished, could remain as long as she wished, could decide to leave or stay at any moment she wanted, that the door to this place had no lock on the outside, only one on the inside. His name was Beckett Holloway, and the only thing he could promise her beneath this roof was that no one, including him, would ever be allowed to lay another finger on her unless she wanted it. When she heard that final sentence, something that had been clamped tight around Emerson's chest for the past 72 hours suddenly broke apart. She didn't sob, didn't collapse. She simply let 2 large tears slide down her cheeks before she was even aware of them. Then 2 more, then a whole quiet stream falling onto the moss-green folds of her dress. She didn't wipe them away. She didn't turn her face aside. Beckett didn't stand, didn't step toward her, didn't offer a handkerchief. He simply remained exactly where he was and let her cry. When her breathing had finally steadied, he set his teacup down, looked directly at her for the first time since she entered the room, and said that there was one question he knew she would ask sooner or later, so he wanted to answer it now, that he hadn't pulled her out of that place because he was good, because he wasn't a good man, but because in the instant she crashed into him in the casino lobby, she had accidentally stirred something inside him that he had thought had died 5 years ago. He didn't explain any further. He only said that one day, when she was strong enough, he would tell her, but not today. Today, the only thing she needed to do was finish her tea, go to sleep, and wake tomorrow in a place where no one could touch her anymore. The 4 days after that conversation in the library passed in a rhythm Emerson had never known could exist. She woke when sunlight poured through the glass, ate breakfast on the terrace with Bridget over toast and homemade fig jam, read in the Olive Garden until noon, drifted into a short nap, then wandered the tiled corridors, studying the old oil paintings that hung along the walls. Beckett appeared now and then at dinner, sat across from her in silence, asked how her day had been, then disappeared into his private study until late into the night. He didn't press, didn't come too close, didn't ask about her past, didn't mention the night in the casino lobby. On the morning of the 5th day, Bridget had to go down into town to buy medicine for Emerson, and said she would be back late. The villa fell into a strange stillness, broken only by the slow turning of the ceiling fan and the sound of starlings singing in the garden. After breakfast, Emerson walked alone along the terracotta corridor, and happened to turn through a wooden door she hadn't noticed 2 days earlier, then stopped dead at the threshold. Inside was a small music room, its ceiling lower than the library's, its walls paneled in honey-colored cherry wood to hold the sound, 3 still-life paintings hanging in perfect symmetry, and in the center of the room, beneath a slant of sunlight pouring down from a skylight, stood a black Steinway & Sons grand piano. Its lid was closed. A thin layer of dust lay over it, enough for Emerson to know that no one had played this instrument in a very long time. She walked toward it 1 step at a time, her heart beating faster, then stood before the piano as though standing before an old friend she had never believed she would see again. Her fingers, the fingers Magda had searched, the fingers Preston had bent back, the fingers that had scraped over the freezing concrete of 35 flights of stairs, were trembling now, not from fear but from a hunger she didn't dare name. She pulled out the bench and sat down, laid both hands on the closed lid, drew one long breath, then slowly lifted it open. The scent of old wood and faint velvet rose toward her. The white ivory keys lay there in silence, waiting for her. She began to play. The first note of Debussy's Clair de Lune trembled so badly it nearly broke, because it had been nearly 2 weeks since her fingers had touched a keyboard. The second note still hesitated, but by the third, the muscle memory carved into her hands through 18 years of relentless practice began to wake, and Debussy's tender, flowing melody poured out like water breaking through a dam, no longer passing through her mind at all, but rising straight from her chest into her fingertips. She didn't realize tears were falling onto the keys until one drop struck the second E, leaving a dark, wet mark on the ivory. The melody had just reached the second development, soft and luminous as moonlight scattered across the surface of a lake, when Emerson felt a presence beyond the open door. She didn't stop at once. She played 3 more measures, then gently lifted her head. Beckett was standing there in the doorway, one hand braced against the wooden frame. His fingers curled tight as though he were holding himself upright by force. He wore a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, his dark hair pushed back and not yet smoothed into place, as if he had left his study in haste. But what made Emerson go still in the middle of the phrase wasn't the way he stood. It was his eyes. Those gray eyes of cold metal she had seen command a gun to be drawn, with nothing but the lift of a hand. The eyes even Victor Volkov hesitated to meet directly were now rimmed red, with 2 wet tracks running down his left cheek that he seemed not even to know were there. Beckett had been standing there for who knew how long, because Clair de Lune was the piece Rosalind used to play on her old Amati violin on nights when she couldn't sleep, and he hadn't heard that melody since the night she died in his arms 5 years earlier. Emerson panicked and started to rise, ready to apologize, one hand lifting toward the lid to close the piano. Beckett shook his head almost imperceptibly. His voice broke on the final syllable, rough and low enough that she had to strain to hear it. He told her not to keep playing. Please. Then he stepped into the room, not toward her, but toward the black leather armchair against the far wall, sat down, leaned his head back, and closed his eyes. Emerson turned back to the piano, placed both hands on the keys, and began Clair de Lune again from the beginning. No one said a word. There was only Debussy's melody, the slow turning of the ceiling fan, and the golden morning light of Nevada slanting through the skylight and falling across the wooden floor in a narrow band that joined the grand piano to the armchair, like a fragile thread neither of them dared name. 2 weeks passed at the Red Rock Canyon estate, like a thin veil draped over old wounds, not healing them completely, but enough for Emerson to walk normally again, enough for the stitches in the soles of her feet to be removed, enough for her lower lip to stop swelling. On a Wednesday morning, she asked Beckett for permission to go out and buy a few personal things, a few sets of underwear, a few books, a bottle of perfume because she couldn't bear the scent of Magda that still clung to her mind every night. Beckett didn't ask anything more. He only nodded and called Finn O'Brien. An hour later, Finn drove her into town in a black Range Rover with tinted windows, parked in the basement of Caesar's Palace, then followed her up into the Forum Shops, the luxury shopping center paved in white stone inside the casino complex, with a vaulted ceiling painted like an artificial sky moving from dawn to dusk in a 3-hour loop. Finn didn't walk close beside her. He stayed exactly 4 steps behind, a wireless earpiece in his left ear, his right hand resting lightly inside his black coat. Emerson had just finished buying a few things at Victoria's Secret and was turning into the corridor that connected the 2 shopping wings when she stopped so suddenly in the middle of the passageway that it was as if roots had shot through her feet into stone. Less than 15 meters away, standing beneath the golden lighting in front of the Hermes counter, was Willow. Her sister was smiling brightly at a sales associate, holding in her right hand a chestnut-brown Birkin bag, 30-centimeter size, in Togo leather, the kind the whole world knew started at no less than $30,000, while her left hand stroked the gold-plated hardware with the expression of someone choosing between 2 colors rather than between buying it or not. She was wearing a brand-new cream silk coat, red-soled Louboutins, her hair freshly dyed a bright copper shade, her lips painted in deep red MAC lipstick. For one suspended instant, Emerson almost didn't recognize her as her own sister, the same woman who had pushed her into the basement of the Crimson Palace a little more than 2 weeks earlier. Willow turned her head to say something to the sales associate, and in that instant, the sisters' eyes met across the white stone floor of the Forum Shops. Willow's smile froze across her face, and the blood drained out of her skin so quickly that the red lipstick became two horrifying streaks against a face gone white as paper. The Birkin slipped from her hand and hit the floor with a dull thud. Emerson walked toward her. Slowly, calmly, one step at a time. She stopped exactly 2 meters away. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She only spoke in a voice so calm that even she hardly recognized it as her own. She asked her sister whether that Birkin was a wedding gift from Victor or the commission from the deal where she sold her own sister that day. Willow stammered, both lips moving without producing a single word. Then she glanced past Emerson and saw a man dressed in black standing 4 steps away with the flat, terrifying eyes of someone long accustomed to blood, and she understood at once that her younger sister no longer walked alone. Willow stepped back once, then twice. She whispered that Emerson didn't understand, that she was a victim too, that Victor had forced her, and she had no choice. Emerson looked into her sister's eyes exactly like their mother's, and the strangest thing she realized in that moment was that she didn't feel pain anymore. Very softly, she said that Willow had just bought a $30,000 bag with the price of 72 hours of her little sister being locked in a basement. Willow didn't answer. She turned and ran, leaving the Birkin on the stone floor, bumping another shopper off balance as she rushed past, sprinting straight toward the escalator down to the basement level. Finn glanced at Emerson, asking without words whether he should go after her. Emerson shook her head. Her sister didn't drive back to Reno that night. She drove straight to the Crimson Palace, all the way up to Victor Volkov's private suite on the 50th floor, and through tears she told him that her little sister had been pulled from his grasp by Beckett Holloway and was now living somewhere out beyond Red Rock Canyon. Victor sat and listened to the whole thing, then gave a dry laugh, lit a Cohiba cigar, and told his right hand that the Wolf of Nevada had finally done one thing right. He had just handed Victor the gift he had been waiting 5 years for. A weakness shaped like a woman. That same evening, Beckett walked into his study at the estate, closed the door, and poured himself a glass of Redbreast 12-year. He didn't drink it. He only stood by the window looking out at Red Rock Canyon sinking slowly into violet shadow, turning the glass in his hand without thinking, his mind moving as fast as a machine. The chance encounter at the Forum Shops wasn't something he could ignore. Willow hadn't reacted like someone crushed only by debt, but like someone who had been prepared for the possibility that her sister might come back. And the fact that she was buying a $30,000 Birkin only 2 weeks after pushing her sister into a basement wasn't the behavior of someone barely surviving in secret. He called Finn in and gave a short order. Fly to Reno that night, dig into the Bennett family thoroughly, and don't miss a single bill, a single phone call, or a single relative. Finn nodded and left without asking one more question. 48 hours later, Finn returned to Red Rock Canyon with a small black USB no bigger than a little finger and a thin file folder in his leather case. He knocked on Beckett's study door close to midnight, when Emerson had already gone to sleep in the room across the hall. Finn set the laptop on the desk, inserted the USB, and played the first video without saying a word. The screen filled with the image of a run-down 2-story wooden house on the outskirts of Reno, its paint peeling, its porch littered with empty Coors Light beer cans and unopened bills. Finn's hidden camera, mounted near the collar of his coat, moved through a filthy living room where a Dallas Cowboys football game was still playing on the television, then into the kitchen. There Arthur Bennett was sitting on a kitchen chair, 58 years old but looking 70, with a swollen belly, thinning gray hair, a stained t-shirt, and a 4th can of Coors in his hand even though the clock had barely struck 11 in the morning. Finn had posed as a creditor from Las Vegas, trying to ask about a loan in the name of Arthur's daughter. In the video, Arthur's voice came out hoarse and contemptuous as he answered, "Emerson, that girl, yeah, Willow already took care of it. The kid can play piano, so Victor's VIP clients will like her. Working in Vegas is the best way for her to pay off the whole family's debt. That's what the younger daughter is supposed to do. Carry the weight. Her mother used to carry it for me too." Then Arthur let out a crude little laugh, took another swallow of beer, and added that besides, the girl didn't have a husband or children, so what was the big deal if she went and did a little of that kind of work? Beckett watched the entire video without blinking. By the time Arthur reached that ugly little laugh, Beckett's left hand, which had been resting on the desk, had slowly curled into a fist. When Finn turned the video off, Beckett still didn't say anything. He only lifted one hand and signaled for Finn to give the rest of the report. Finn opened the second file, pulled out a white printed sheet from the internal system of the Crimson Palace, leaked to the Irish Alliance by a source deep inside. It was the Bennett family's debt record at the casino. The first debt was in Willow Bennett's name, $780,000, cleared on the exact day Emerson was taken into the basement. That was the number Emerson had found on the receipt in her coat pocket on the first night. But there was a second debt she didn't know about. The second was in Arthur Bennett's name, $340,000, accumulated over 11 years through poker, college football betting, and high-interest loans taken out to cover losses. Together, the Bennett family's total debt to Victor Volkov came to $1,120,000. And both debts had been marked paid on the same day, at the same hour, under the same approval signature from Victor. That meant Emerson hadn't been betrayed by one person, or by two. She had been handed over as collateral by her entire family. Beckett stared down at the file for a long time. Then the left hand that had been clenched all this time suddenly slammed down on the walnut desk with enough force to make the redbreast glass jump beside it. Finn heard bone and tendon strike wood, then saw a thin line of blood begin to slide from the knuckle of Beckett's middle finger, fall onto the desk in one dark red drop. Then a second. Beckett didn't seem to notice. He was still looking at the paper. At last Finn asked quietly, in his steady voice, "Did he want the old man handled, sir?" Beckett shook his head very slowly. He said no. That decision had to be Emerson's. It was something he had never done in 15 years as a boss. Let a woman decide the fate of her own enemy. But he knew this was the only thing he could give her that no one else ever had. The next morning, after Beckett waited for Emerson to finish breakfast on the terrace, he invited her into his study. His right hand had been wrapped again in a small, clean bandage, and he made sure she didn't see the dried blood on the desktop that had already been wiped away at dawn. He sat across from her with an open laptop between them. His voice was low but steady as he said there were things she needed to know, and he didn't want to hide them from her for another second, that she had the right to decide what came next after she saw this. But first she had to know. Emerson gave the slightest nod. He pressed play. On the screen appeared the image of a cluttered kitchen in Reno, with the sound of a Dallas Cowboys game drifting in from the television, and Arthur Bennett's hoarse, contemptuous voice rang out, saying word for word that Willow had already taken care of it, that the girl had talent at the piano so Victor's VIP clients would like her, that the younger daughter ought to know how to carry the burden. Emerson never looked away from the screen. She sat with her back straight, both hands resting neatly on her knees, not flinching, not trembling, not blinking. When Arthur let out that ugly little laugh at the end, she still didn't react. Beckett switched off the video and laid a hand over the laptop lid to close it. He said nothing, giving her time. Emerson sat still for about a minute, then began to speak, her voice low and even, as though she were reading from someone else's diary. She said that apparently for the past 27 years, she had never had a family at all. She said her mother hadn't died carrying only herself away. She had taken with her the very idea of home, and everything after that had only been an empty room. Emerson kept trying to decorate with fake laughter and fake dinners. She said she had spent 15 years trying to be a good daughter, a kind sister, a dutiful niece, only to realize that she had never been a human being in that house, only an asset with value until the final day of use. When she finished speaking, she finally lifted her eyes to Beckett. She wasn't crying. He was the one who felt his chest tighten. He reached his bandaged right hand across the table and placed it over the back of her left hand, the first deliberate touch between them since the night in the casino lobby. He told her that she did have a family. Now, she had him. Emerson looked at his hand for a long time, then gently turned her own palm upward beneath it and laced her fingers through his. That was the only answer she could give in that moment. That evening after dinner, Beckett asked whether she wanted to hear the story he had promised her in the library on that first night. She nodded. He stood, took a small ring of keys from the desk drawer, and led her down the eastern hallway. At the end of the corridor, they stopped in front of the heavy oak door Bridget had warned her never to try to open. Beckett slid the key into the lock, turned it once, and pushed the door inward. The air inside carried the scent of old wood, and a woman's perfume faded almost entirely away, the scent of a moment frozen in time for 5 years without being touched. The room wasn't dusty, because Bridget still entered 3 times a year to clean it in silence, but everything had been kept exactly as it was on the final morning its owner was still alive there. A wide bed lay beneath perfectly folded white sheets. A walnut dressing table stood nearby with an open bottle of Chanel No. 5, positioned exactly in the center, and a deep red Chanel Rouge Allure lipstick resting on its side, as if it had just been set down. In a glass cabinet in the corner, resting on red velvet, stood an old Amati violin in the Cremona style. On the wall hung a large black and white photograph of a woman around 30, smiling, with dark hair pinned low and blue-gray eyes. Beckett stopped in the center of the room, stared at the photograph for a long time, then began to speak. He said her name was Rosalind Holloway, his wife, who had died 5 years earlier at the age of 31. He said the Volkov family, led by Victor's father and by Victor's own hand, had taken her from the parking lot of a flower shop she visited every Saturday morning. As revenge against him for a port dispute in northern Nevada, they couldn't win through negotiation. They held her for 36 hours, didn't release her, didn't ask for ransom. They only wanted him to suffer. When his right-hand man finally got coordinates through an ally inside the Volkov side, Beckett drove for 4 hours to an abandoned warehouse in the eastern part of Nevada and broke the door in. Rosalind was still alive, but only barely strong enough to whisper 4 words into his chest, that he had come too late, and then she died in his arms before the ambulance could arrive. By the time Beckett reached the end of the story, his voice had gone so dry it was breaking apart. He stood motionless in the middle of the room, those gray eyes all of Nevada feared now rimmed red, with 2 wet tracks running down his face, and this time he didn't bother to wipe them away. It was the second time in 5 years he had cried. The first had been with Rosalind in his arms. The second was in front of Emerson. Emerson said nothing. She stepped forward, wrapped both arms around his back, and held him, not with the embrace of pity, but with the embrace of someone who understood in the marrow what it meant to lose a person you had once promised to protect. Beckett stood still for a moment, as though he didn't know how to respond, then slowly folded his arms around her, rested his chin on the top of her head, and drew in one long breath. When she lifted her face to look at him, the distance between them was only a few inches. Neither of them had time to think whether they should or shouldn't. Beckett bent down. Emerson lifted her chin, and their first kiss happened not in passion, not in hunger, but in a gentleness that felt almost like a vow. Neither of them spoke aloud. Their lips met like 2 storms that had shed their last tears and finally found a place to come to rest. 3 days after the night in Rosalind's room, Beckett was forced to fly to New York for the quarterly meeting he had committed to 4 months earlier with the investment board of Holloway Capital, a meeting on the 58th floor of the building in Midtown Manhattan that would last an entire day and focus on pulling money out of underground casinos and moving it into legitimate real estate. He left Red Rock Canyon at 4 a.m, kissed Emerson on the forehead while she was still asleep, instructed Finn to leave 2 bodyguards at the main gate and 1 man patrolling the back garden, then boarded the private jet departing from Henderson Executive Airport. Emerson woke close to 9, had breakfast with Bridget on the terrace as usual, and because it was a bright Saturday with sunlight that wasn't too harsh, Bridget invited her out into the back garden to pick lavender so she could make a batch of dried tea for Emerson to take with her later. The garden stretched toward the foot of the red cliffs, with rows of deep purple lavender planted more than 10 years earlier near, bees weaving over the blossoms, the air so sweet and still that Emerson almost forgot she was living in a world where people could be killed over a single wrong nod. She and Bridget had nearly filled 1 basket, and Bridget was lifting a sprig toward Emerson with a faint tremor in her hand so she could smell it, when the shriek of tires from the front gate cut through the air. 2 seconds later, a metallic crash like an explosion thundered through the wall as the iron gate was rammed head-on by a black Chevy Tahoe SUV, ripped off its hinges, and sent flying through the alarm wires. Emerson hadn't even turned around yet, when Bridget dropped the basket of lavender onto the ground and shoved her hard toward the thick olive hedge along the side, shouting at her to run toward the chapel in the west wing, to call Finn on the emergency phone. Emerson made it 3 steps before she heard a heavy thud, and then the sound of a body crashing down behind her, and without even looking back, she knew Bridget had been struck with the butt of a gun. 2 men in black ski masks came around the side of the house and cut her off between the lavender rows. The first was tall and lean, the second was shorter and heavier. Both wore semi-military tactical jackets. She drove her knee into the heavier man's groin on instinct and spun to run the other way, but the taller one caught her wrist and twisted it behind her back so hard she screamed. At that exact moment, the heavier man pulled a small syringe already loaded with a powerful dose of ketamine from his jacket pocket, plunged it straight into the left side of her neck, and drove the plunger down in one brutal motion. Everything in Emerson's vision began to smear like oil paint flooded with water. The scent of lavender turned metallic. The sunlight dimmed from the edges inward, until the center of her sight began to darken. In the final second before she collapsed, she saw Bridget lying on her side in the grass with a dark ribbon of blood running from her temple. But her chest was still rising and falling, which meant she was alive. Then everything went black. 8 hours later in Manhattan, Beckett was sitting at the head of an 8-meter-long rectangular conference table on the 58th floor, when the iPhone lying face down on the table vibrated in an unusual pattern 3 times in a row. He glanced down, saw Finn's number, and in 15 years, Finn had never called him in the middle of a meeting, unless it was the kind of situation where 1 minute of delay turned into blood. Beckett stood without apology, walked out into the glass hallway, and pressed the phone to his ear. On the other end, Finn's voice was calm in exactly the way it always became when the situation was at its worst, reporting that they had taken her, that Bridget was badly injured but stable, that the camera behind the house had captured the Tahoe's license plate, registered under a fake Nevada identity, and that the final tracking signal before it vanished led back toward the Crimson Palace. Beckett stood completely still for 3 seconds, looking through the glass at Central Park below. His face didn't change by so much as a single muscle. He ended the call with Finn, opened his contacts, and found a number he hadn't called in 3 years. FBI Special Agent Harlan Brooks answered after 2 rings from the Las Vegas field office. Beckett didn't greet him. He said only one sentence in a voice so flat, it was more terrifying than anger. "You still owe me a favor from the fall of 2021, and now it's time to pay it back. I need every traffic and highway camera feed in the state of Nevada within 2 hours, and I need a federal SWAT team ready to move at 2 in the morning tomorrow." On the other end of the line, Harlan was silent for exactly 1 breath, then replied, "Send me the coordinates." Beckett returned to the meeting room exactly 3 minutes after his call with Harlan, looked at the investment board, and announced in a voice that allowed no argument that the meeting was suspended indefinitely. The contracts would be signed later, and he would personally absorb every cost caused by the delay. Before the 6 investors could even react, they saw him walk out of the room. In the elevator down to the ground floor, he made 2 more calls. The first ordering his private pilot to prepare the plane for departure back to Henderson within an hour, the second to a private number that began with a New York area code. His sister, Isadora Holloway, answered on the first ring. He said only 1 sentence. "Book rouse for 6 people in 40 minutes. Call all 5 of them. No one is allowed to be absent." Isadora didn't ask why. She only answered clearly and hung up. 42 minutes later, the black Escalade carrying Beckett and 2 bodyguards stopped in front of a small Italian restaurant with red tile floors and a 70s-style interior in East Harlem, a place where getting a table meant waiting 10 years if you weren't on the list. And that list had never been longer than 30 families in the entire East Coast. Inside, the light was dim and golden. The tablecloths were red and white checkered, and an old Frank Sinatra record was turning slowly. 5 men were already seated at the long table at the back of the room. 5 heads of Irish and Italian families who hadn't sat at the same table in 10 years since the Red Hook port dispute. At the head of the Callahan house, the McGuire house, and the O'Sullivan house on the Irish side, and the Gallo house and the Palmieri house on the Italian side. All of them were over 60, gray-haired, dressed in expensive dark suits, each accompanied by exactly 1 bodyguard standing against the wall behind him. Beckett stepped in, removed his outer jacket, and hung it over the chair, then sat down at the head of the table. Isadora sat on his right, 32 years old, dark hair cut to her shoulders, dressed in a charcoal women's suit, with a laptop already open to a screen divided into 4 frames displaying a map of Nevada, a troop roster, the blueprint of the Crimson Palace, and account numbers. He placed a bottle of Macallan 50 Year in the middle of the table, the kind of bottle of which fewer than 200 remained in the world, with an opening auction price of nearly $500,000. The 5 old bosses looked at the bottle, then looked at him. No one touched a glass. Beckett began without wasting a word. He said that Viktor Volkov had killed his wife 5 years earlier, something he had chosen to live with in order to preserve peace for all 5 families. Now Viktor had taken the woman who belonged to him tonight, from his own backyard, and had badly injured a woman who had served his family for 32 years. He was going to level every Volkov operation in the state of Nevada within the next 24 hours, with no negotiation and no retreat. He was offering an alliance for 1 night only, under specific terms already written in the 5 folders Isadora had just slid across the table to each of them. Whoever stood with him tonight would get their share. The Callahan house would take Reno Port, which had been in Volkov hands for 12 years. The McGuire house would take the federal liquor transport route along the Reno-Salt Lake corridor. The O'Sullivan house would take 3 secondary casino properties off the Strip. The Gallo house and the Palmieri house would divide 15% of the Crimson Palace itself after he took control. He said he didn't need soldiers. He already had 80 men of his own. What he needed was silent consent, meaning not one of the 5 families would send anyone to stand in his way tonight, even if Volkov came knocking at their doors. The old man at the head of the Callahan house, 74-year-old Connor Callahan, the only man at the table who had once carried Beckett in his arms when Beckett was 10 years old, looked at him for a long time and asked only one question. He asked who this woman was to him. Beckett. The whole table fell silent. Beckett placed both hands on the wood, looked straight into Connor's eyes, and answered that she was the reason he had started living again. Connor gave one very slow nod, then reached for the Macallan bottle and poured himself a glass. The other 4 old bosses followed one by one. 20 minutes later, all 5 signatures were on the 5 brief agreements Isadora had just printed from the miniature printer inside her case. When Beckett walked out of Rouse, Isadora had already closed the laptop and was on the phone coordinating. 80 men from Las Vegas, Reno, and Phoenix, divided into 12 vehicles, weapons, armor, $2 million in cash to bribe highway patrol that night. Everything would assemble at the rendezvous point 45 minutes from Red Rock at 1:30 in the morning. Beckett stepped into the Escalade without looking back, and for the first time in 17 hours since Finn's call, he allowed himself to smile. A thin smile, a cold smile, and a very brief one. At exactly 2 in the morning on Sunday, the Crimson Palace was still alive with noise in the main lobby, because Vegas never sleeps, but the 50th floor had been cleared of guests by Victor, leaving only his most trusted staff behind. The Alliance's 80 soldiers came in at once in 4 separate waves. The first, led by Finn O'Brien, blew through the north parking garage gate. The second came through the east delivery entrance. The third climbed in through the emergency stairwell from the building next door, the one the Gallo family had bought 6 months earlier. The fourth was Beckett himself, with 6 of his core bodyguards, going straight up in the private service elevator, using an access card Isadora had obtained through a source inside the security department. In the first 7 minutes, Finn took down 12 guards, armed with AR-15 rifles along the basement levels and side corridors, using a Sig Sauer P226 and an MP5 fitted with a suppressor, and not a single alarm siren went off because Isadora, working from New York, had crashed the central security system with an exploit her tech division had bought from a hacker in Estonia 4 months earlier. The gamblers in the main lobby heard only a few distant dull pops, assumed it was some fireworks machine for another late-night grand opening, and kept placing their bets. On the 50th floor, Victor Volkov stood beside the glass wall looking down at the Las Vegas Strip, a Cohiba Behike cigar in one hand, wearing a silk robe the color of dark wine that exposed an old diagonal scar across his collarbone. He was 52 years old, gray at both temples now, with pale blue merciless eyes. In the middle of the room, Emerson was tied to an armchair with nylon restraints around her wrists, the mark of the needle still visible on her neck, her eyes only beginning to clear after 8 hours of unconsciousness. 2 meters away from her was Willow, not tied up but kneeling on the marble floor, the left side of her face swollen beyond recognition, her upper lip split in a long tear, one eye completely darkened with bruising. She had run here the night before, believing Victor would protect her, but when his plan went off script because Beckett hadn't come to negotiate and had come to make war, Victor had struck her 3 times in a row for bringing into his house prey that had become too expensive. The double oak doors to the room exploded inward off their hinges. Beckett stepped in, his white shirt streaked with other people's blood across one shoulder and along his left arm, a Glock 17 in his right hand, 6 bodyguards spreading in a crescent behind him. Victor turned around very slowly, gave a mocking smile, then without waiting for an invitation walked straight to Emerson, pulled a chrome-plated Beretta from his waistband, and pressed the barrel to her temple. In English, heavy with Russian accent, he said that if Beckett took one more step, the girl would end the same way Rosalind had. Beckett froze for the length of one heartbeat. Then the corner of his mouth lifted into a smile that never reached his eyes, and he bent down slowly, set the Glock on the floor, and nudged it toward the wall with the toe of his shoe. He asked Victor whether he knew why he hadn't killed him in the last 5 years, and then answered it himself, because he had wanted him alive long enough to be present for this exact day. Victor asked what day. Beckett said, "The day you lose everything." At that exact moment, federal sirens rose from 8 directions around the building. An FBI helicopter circled above the roof, and Harlan Brooks's voice cut through the glass over a loudspeaker ordering surrender. Every muscle in Victor's face twitched once. He blinked for half a second as he glanced down toward the street. Half a second was enough. Emerson, the woman Beckett had spent the last 3 weeks thinking was only fragile now, had been watching Victor from the moment he stepped close. She had noticed the slight weakness in his right knee from an old injury, something she recognized from the small wince he made when he had risen from the chair earlier. She drove all her strength into both legs, lifted the hard heel of her shoe, and kicked sharply into the back of Victor's right knee. He let out a harsh grunt and buckled, the Beretta shifting 5 centimeters away from her temple. She threw her shoulder into his arm, knocking it aside, and the gun fell onto the carpet. She bent down, grabbed it with both hands still tangled in the loosened restraint, rose to her feet, and pointed the barrel straight at the center of Victor's forehead, her hands shaking violently, but her index finger already resting on the trigger. The whole room fell silent. Beckett looked at her. He didn't panic. He walked toward her with slow, deliberate steps, circled around Victor where he knelt, came to stand beside her, and placed his right hand over the back of hers. He didn't push the gun down. He didn't pull it away. He only laid his hand there. Very softly, he told her not to, that she didn't need to stain her hands with blood, that this part belonged to him. Emerson's finger trembled once more, then slowly eased off the trigger. She let the gun fall into his hand. Beckett took the Beretta, looked at Victor, and didn't shoot. Instead, he reversed the weapon and smashed the butt of it into Victor's right temple. Victor collapsed unconscious onto the floor, blood spreading across the marble beneath his head. Beckett bent down near his ear and said in a voice no louder than breathing, "Live, Victor. Live long enough to go to prison. Life without parole is the real hell." The service elevator doors opened, and Harlan Brooks stepped in with 6 FBI agents in black jackets marked in yellow, their guns lowering when they saw the room was already finished. Beckett gave Harlan a brief nod, walked to Emerson, cut the restraints from her wrists with the small knife from his vest pocket, and pulled her into his arms. She buried her face against his chest, and at last, after 3 weeks and 7 days, she let herself truly cry. 3 months had passed since the night the FBI surrounded the Crimson Palace, and Las Vegas had reshaped itself in the way only Beckett Holloway knew how to orchestrate. The United States Department of Justice charged Victor Volkov with 17 federal counts, ranging from interstate human trafficking, money laundering, and bribery of public officials to conspiracy to commit murder and armed kidnapping. With the enormous volume of evidence Harlan Brooks had spent 4 years building, combined with 47 victim statements from the women rescued that night, Victor's defense attorneys didn't even bother trying to negotiate for a reduced sentence. The trial in the Federal District Court of Nevada was over within 9 weeks. The jury returned a unanimous verdict. The final sentence was life without parole, to be served at the ADX Florence Federal Supermax Prison in Colorado, where the most dangerous criminals in the country were held in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day. Willow Bennett, after agreeing to serve as the chief witness against Victor, had her sentence reduced from what should have been 25 years down to 8 at a federal women's prison in Dublin, California. Magda, who had attempted to flee the state during the chaos of the raid, was captured by Finn's men near the Arizona border and handed over to federal authorities. She was subsequently sentenced to 20 years without the possibility of parole for her lead role in the trafficking operation. On the day of final sentencing, Emerson was in the courtroom, seated in the 3rd row, wearing a simple gray knit coat. When Willow was led past the center aisle with her hands cuffed behind her back, she turned to search for her sister one last time, and this time there was no fear in her eyes and no apology, only the hollow, exhausted look of someone who had finally understood what she had traded away with her own hands. Emerson neither nodded nor shook her head. She only placed her right palm lightly against her chest above her heart, then turned her face away. That was the last forgiveness she could offer, and it was also goodbye. 6 weeks after Victor's trial, Arthur Bennett died in the emergency room at Renown Regional Hospital in Reno from a brain hemorrhage caused by complications from late-stage fatty liver disease and 12 years of alcoholism, along with the psychological shock of losing every gambling asset he had borrowed against under Victor's shadow after the casino was shut down. Emerson received the call at 8 in the evening from a nurse on duty. The woman asked whether she wanted to come identify the body, and Emerson said no. She didn't attend the funeral. She sent enough money to cover a decent cremation, no more and no less, and requested that the ashes be scattered in the desert rather than buried beside her mother. It was the first decision she had made in her life without asking anyone else for permission. The 47 girls rescued from the basement that night were transferred to a recovery center on the outskirts of Henderson, funded entirely by Beckett. Della Price was the first person Emerson went to visit, once Della had stabilized enough emotionally to receive guests. The two women held each other in the center's visiting room for 20 minutes without saying a single word, Della's tears soaking through Emerson's shoulder into one large damp stain. And when Della finally spoke, the first thing she said was, "Thank you for keeping your promise." Emerson used part of the money Beckett transferred into her private account, with no conditions attached, to establish the Second Dawn Foundation, a nonprofit registered in the state of Nevada, with the mission of providing legal support, psychological care, housing, and job training for trafficking survivors across the western United States. The foundation was headquartered in Henderson, with satellite offices in Reno and Phoenix, and had formal partnerships with 4 hospitals and 2 community colleges in the state. Della received the foundation's first scholarship. She enrolled in social work at the University of Nevada, Reno, while also completing a parallel program in nonprofit management. 2 years later, when she turned 21 and held her honors bachelor's degree in her hands, Emerson gave her the position of executive director of the Second Dawn Foundation at a small ceremony attended by Bridget, Beckett, and exactly 20 staff members. Della stood in front of the foundation's logo, a rising sun lifting behind a line of red stone cliffs, holding the microphone with trembling hands, and said that 4 months in the basement had taught her that hope was something that could be killed. But after 2 years working at this foundation, she had learned that hope was also something that could be brought back to life, if even one person was willing to come back and pull you out. 6 months after the day Della was appointed executive director of the Second Dawn Foundation, on a late April afternoon, when the sky above Red Rock Canyon was slowly shifting from orange to violet over the peaks of the red cliffs, Beckett led Emerson up to the rooftop terrace of the estate, a pale travertine space with 4 olive trees in large pots placed at the 4 corners, a place she had never even realized existed during the 30 months she had lived there. Bridget had already arranged a small table draped in white linen, with 2 glasses of Napa Valley red wine, a little vase of lavender from the very garden where Emerson had almost been taken that year, and an old record player softly playing Claire de Lune on piano. Emerson climbed the final steps wearing the same moss-green silk dress she had worn on that first night in the library, and before she could understand what was happening, Beckett had already turned to face her and drawn a small navy velvet box from the pocket of his black suit jacket. He opened it. Inside was a platinum ring set with a 2-carat blue diamond, exactly the color of Emerson's eyes when sunlight struck them at an angle, surrounded by a circle of small white diamonds. Beckett lowered himself onto one knee on the stone, and his right hand, once bandaged after the night he struck the desk, now bore only a small scar, but he placed that hand over the left side of his chest. He said he wasn't a good man, that he had a past soaked in blood that he might never wash clean for the rest of his life. But from the moment she crashed into his chest in the casino lobby that night, something inside him had started breathing again after 5 years of clinical death. He said she had taught him something Rosalind had once tried to teach him, but he hadn't learned in time, that sometimes you have to lose everything before you find what truly matters, and he had already lost Rosalind once, and he didn't want to lose again. He told her that she wasn't a replacement for anyone, that she was an entirely new miracle that belonged only to him. He asked, "Emerson Bennett, will you agree to become Mrs. Holloway? Not the wife of a crime boss, but the wife of a man who is learning all over again how to love someone properly." Emerson cried, not with sobs, but with the tears of someone who had finally come to believe she was worthy of being loved. She nodded. 1 month later, the wedding took place at a small wooden lodge on the shore of Lake Tahoe on the Nevada side, among green pine trees and water so still it looked like glass. Exactly 30 guests were there. Bridget, in the dark blue dress she had had specially made 8 weeks earlier, was the one who walked Emerson down the grassy path, scattered with dried lavender petals. Emerson's hair, though still shorter than before due to Magda's shears, was styled into an elegant, soft bob that framed her radiant face, taking the place that should have belonged to a father who had never once deserved it. Finn O'Brien stood as Beckett's witness. Isadora stood to the left of her future sister-in-law holding the wedding bouquet. Della Price flew in from Reno, wearing a soft red dress, and sat in the front row. Harlan Brooks was there too, for the first time in a suit instead of his FBI badge. And when Emerson and Beckett exchanged rings beneath the white floral arch set beside the water's edge, with sunset pouring gold over the lake, she finally understood something that for the first 27 years of her life, she had understood wrong. That heaven isn't the place where we are born, isn't the house that carries our Father's name, isn't the family that shares our blood. Heaven is the place where we are loved sincerely, and sometimes we have to walk through an entire basement of hell before we find it. The story of Emerson Holloway, the woman who had once been sold by her own family, forgotten in the basement of a casino, and believed she would die unnamed at the age of 27, closed at last in the evening light beside Lake Tahoe, with a blue diamond ring on her left hand, and a man standing beside her who had sworn he would never come too late again. And from this story, there is one lesson we want to send to everyone who has stayed with us this far. That blood doesn't always mean love, and real family sometimes comes from people who have never shared a single drop of our blood. That kindness and courage, no matter how brutally crushed, are never useless things, because as long as we can still hold on to them, one day a hand will reach out and pull us from the mud. That none of us deserves to be treated like an object to be traded. And walking away from toxic relationships isn't betrayal, but an act of loving ourselves after waiting far too long. If this story moved you or stirred something in your own life right now, please leave a comment below the video and share the most honest feeling in your heart, because every comment you leave is a source of strength that helps us keep telling more meaningful stories. Please don't forget to like the video and turn on the subscription bell so you won't miss any emotional stories we post each day. And if you feel this story could reach someone you know, please share it with them, because sometimes the right story at the right moment can change an entire life. We wish every one of you watching this video good health, a peaceful life, a heart warm enough to keep loving, and strong enough to keep moving forward no matter how hard the road ahead may be. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.